Good morning. It's Wednesday, March 8th. This is TalkingPoint Live. I'm Eric Young here with my colleague Jen Kohler.
Yeah.
It's National Women's Day, and so you can just sit there and not do anything apparently.
Hey, you brought me hot chocolate.
I did
Thank
to
you very
go through
much.
and
Thank
celebrate
you.
that.
Thanks.
And we're wishing all of you in our audience a happy International Women's Day as well. We're coming to you live from the campus of Dixie State University in St. George, Utah, on the event that maybe you didn't know where that was. So, you've got a whole list of things you want to go through today.
I do. I have a list, and the first thing I want to make sure we talk about or mention is that tomorrow, here on the DSU campus in the lobby of the Gardner building at noon, is one of our Pizza and Politics being sponsored by actually not only the Institute of Politics and Public Affairs, but also the Women's Resource Center, and I think the Diversity Center. So,
very good.
yeah, we're going to have lots of pizza or treats, whatever, good food. And we're going to have three, the topic is women in politics. We're going to have three women with us. Betty Ariel, who's on our city council and represents Mike Lee's office here in St. George. Then Pat Jones from the state legislature, and retired state legislator Nancy Lyon will be the three panelists tomorrow at noon. So the community is welcome to attend as well, and especially for students.
This is a very rare thing, actually. We were talking about International Women's Day,
Right.
and you'd indicated that the United States ranks
104
104th
in countries
out of the democracies that are out there in terms of women involved in politics. Is that right?
represented in their national legislative bodies.
104th.
Right, and Rwanda has actually a majority of women legislators in that over their male counterparts in their national legislature, and the U.S. is 104. And I believe last numbers I saw, Utah was below the U.S. national average for representation of women in politics.
See this look of not being surprised.
Yes, you look not surprised at all. Yes. So hopefully tomorrow will be interesting, and maybe that will be one of the topics we address is how do you describe that, how do you account for that discrepancy, and is there something to be done about it? Should something be done about it? Some nations actually have a quota, a 30% or 50%. One nation has a 50% quota, have to be half and half.
Wow. I mean, because that's kind
Half
of how
the population
shakes
would
out.
be, yes.
You think? I'm amazed by that. I'm biting my tongue on so many
That's
things
okay.
here.
Well, don't. I don't
in
want
those
to see you.
Well, I'm not going to start bleeding or
Okay,
anything
good.
that way profusely.
I'm not good with blood.
No, I am not either there as it goes.
What else about International Women's Day?
Well, I think it's fascinating that it's a big deal this year, especially on the heels of the Women's March in Washington post-inauguration. There's a lot of attention being drawn to that. We didn't have this conversation certainly last year, or the year before, or the year before that. And yet this is an activity, a celebration, a recognition that goes back to 1908.
Oh,
And
I
it was
didn't know
International
that.
Working Women's Day. That's since been dropped, I think, from the whole concept of Women's Day in that respect, because there is
Because
also...
what is a working woman?
Exactly.
Any woman who's alive and breathing, in my opinion?
Exactly, right. That's been hotly contested for a number of years between the idea of stay-at-home moms, which is in and of itself, as a description, ridiculous, that you have to be a stay-at-home person in order to be a mom, versus working mothers. And there's been a divide amongst women along that line. I think that might be the reason why the whole working women's thing has been dropped from that. So there's a concept of disaccord even within, obviously, the gender itself, in terms of what self-actualizes a female as a woman in that respect. Helen Fisher, who I quote often here on the show, it seems like, she's an anthropologist, and she goes on to say, and I have to agree with her, that until we find a level of equality between the sexes, and I can say genders as well there, because there's inequality along that line, and we could talk all day long about the difference between sex and gender, but she says that nothing else will be taken care of. We won't solve or even adequately address any of the other societal issues like poverty or racism or anything until we go through and actually get to a point to where men and women are recognized as individual feet on the same body. They serve a purpose, a general purpose in advancing humanity, but they do it in different ways along those lines.
Same purpose, different ways. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and that's her analogy as she goes into that. But that's not on your list, though. In a
well,
way.
we don't have to stick to my list.
No, I want to talk about it because
Okay.
it's your
All
day.
right.
So
I get. Oh my gosh! All right.
here we go.
I'll throw my weight around here.
But the United States is celebrating a day without a woman.
Today?
Well, not the United States.
Because I need to go home if that's the case.
The idea is
work on my novel.
like we did a day without a Mexican a little while ago. Today
Or
is
immigrant? It was a day without Mexican or a day without
well,
immigrants?
okay. There's a documentary out called A Day Without a Mexican as well,
Okay.
and it actually, yes, it was a day without a Mexican as it factors into that, which is interesting because we didn't see any repercussions of that. What's the other side of Mexican migrant workers not showing up to work that day? We didn't get the effect of the cause of what was going on there. And likewise today, so listening to the radio, the effort in recognizing International Women's Day is that it'll be a day without a woman. So that's why I bought your chocolate today, so you wouldn't have to, okay? So you're not supposed to buy anything, and you're not supposed to go to work.
Oh, well then I will just go to my classes and say, I'm having the day off.
There you go.
I'm going to go home and work on my novel.
Okay, I think that's a great idea there to do. So I was going to encourage my spouse to do the same thing, but she works with women all day long. And
Right.
can't
Well, and I
do
was
that.
going to say, I would actually really miss being with my students today. I would feel literally deprived.
Right.
So I don't want to deprive myself
Yeah,
either.
I
It's an
understand
interesting notion. Okay.
By the way, if you happen to be listening to our broadcast, you're more than welcome to go through and comment on our Facebook page at Talking Point Live. It's facebook.com/Talking Point Live. And I'll be monitoring our comments as we go through and chat here. So you wanted to go back to this whole concept of media bias.
I do because I'm fascinated by it,
You are.
obviously.
You have an obsession here about
I
media
do.
bias.
All right, obsession. I love that. Well, remember a few weeks ago we talked.
Wait a minute. There was something else you wanted to cover, though.
Okay.
It was feedback from a...
Oh, yes, from a viewer.
I'm sorry, it was what?
I know what you're doing. You are interrupting me.
I'm interrupting.
And throwing me off my train of thought, helter skelter. Yes. So what about that? So I did get a comment from a viewer saying that he interrupts her a lot. He interrupts you a lot, and it was kind of like that you were picking on me, or she was defending me as the person, like being slightly victimized by all the interruptions.
I don't know if I'd go so far. Do you feel victimized?
No, and
Okay.
she didn't use that word, but
Oh,
that's
okay.
kind of the idea that she had to stick up for me, or that I should.
Good.
Yes.
Good. I'm glad
Right.
that that's...
It was another woman, by the way, that noticed that,
Right.
and it'd be interesting to know if there were any men watching the show that feel like you are interrupting me
That
a
we
lot,
picked up on
or if that was a female perspective.
I have my doubts.
You have your doubts. What?
In terms of men recognizing that that's the activity that I got into. So,
Yeah.
and I'm not defending myself here because she's absolutely right. I do interrupt you. And for whatever reason I might end
Do
up...
I interrupt you?
You just did.
Okay, good. Just checking.
So
Yes.
we can do this quid pro
Right.
quo kind of interrupting thing back and forth.
Right.
And
We have agreed that we like this style of interaction with one another, and that it serves the dynamic
Good.
of what we're doing,
All
right?
So now I don't have to say that, but I'll say it anyway. In the context of doing live television, we obviously are under a time constraint, and if I feel we're coming down to that point, or we need to progress our conversation, I might go through and interrupt you. And
We need to clarify as we go along, right? Right? We need to clarify.
We need
as
to
go
clarify
along.
a little bit as
And
we-
those of us with short memories and attention spans can often
we have to go back and revisit maybe
forget
what's
what it
happened
was,
with that.
right? That we
Plus,
were.
there's this little ebb and flow, give and take between us in terms of our personality.
Yeah.
No, I noticed she didn't say, Jen, why are you interrupting Eric all the time?
She didn't mention that. No.
Do you? Do you feel that
In
you're
the
interruptive?
I don't know. We could keep score and see who does it the most.
Well, maybe that's something you guys can do, is go through and keep score that way.
Who's the biggest interrupter? Eric
Okay,
or
these
Jen?
guys can go through.
Is
and,
Jen the biggest interrupter, or is Eric? I come from a
Yeah.
family of major compulsive interrupters, so it takes a lot for me to actually not interrupt somebody. If I get inspired, or, you know, if I get, what do you call it? If I start to resonate with something, or I have a reaction.
Yeah. Boom,
Yeah.
you're gone. You're like
But
the horse seeing the barn.
The important thing is we have agreed with one another that this is appropriate and okay with each of us.
Right.
Right. Not everybody is going to
but-
interact that way.
So here's the problem with interrupting, okay? And I teach this in my interpersonal class,
Okay.
that it is actually antithetical. It goes against good discourse.
How so?
Because
Please tell.
when you're interrupting somebody, there are two things that are going on. One, you're proving that you're not listening to what it is that they're saying.
Well, by reacting to what they're saying, you just listened.
No.
If you weren't
And
listening,
second-
you wouldn't even know
and
what to
second-
interrupt with. I'm listening.
You feel that what you have to say is more important than what the other person is saying, so you're going to go through and verbally step on them as a result of doing that.
That's quite possible. That's a way to interpret it.
Well, that's the way you see it, Eric.
Oh, okay.
All right, enough of this navel gazing, as we've been
Right,
accused of as well
right.
here, but I want to put that into context that
Sure.
I actually enjoy interrupting you. It's a lot of
Right,
fun.
and I enjoy being interrupted.
And I know what it is. I know when I'm doing it. It's not like it's a habit that I'm putting out
Oh,
there. I try
you're
to
consciously-
If we didn't have a confine of time to go
Right.
by, I would sit back and let you spew freely.
Especially when when there needs to be clarification, like, do I understand what you're saying correctly?
Yes.
Because, you know, that's important. Because you know what I find? If I hold the question, I've got to keep it there in the front, and then it's hard for me to actually pay attention to what you're saying.
It's a
because
third reason.
I'm afraid, unless I start taking notes.
Right.
And then I can focus on what you're saying, but then I have to stop and take the notes and then come back. So
It's the third reason why we
So
interrupt. I might forget
yes. It's
what
important.
it is.
It's really important to figure out with whoever you're talking how that works.
Note taking is perfectly fine, especially when you're in an escalated situation where one person is just letting it go. The last thing you need to do is interrupt that process in terms of their self-disclosure, whatever it is they might be talking about. And there's no problem with going through and just taking a note or two. So I want to come back to this, I want to come back to this, but I'm not going to go through and interrupt your process. We call this passive listening, by the way, you know that. As we go through and listen to somebody who is in an escalated state, you might take a few notes, and then once they've exhausted that, we might even wait a few moments there, see what else might come out, and then we go back and say, okay, when I was listening to you, there are a couple things that came to mind, and here's what they are. I'm going to go back and talk to you about it.
I like that approach. That's good.
Passive listening technique.
Passive implies, though, that you're not paying attention.
Yeah,
but that's not
that's
what
not
this
true.
is. This seems very active in the sense that you're listening carefully and being
In terms
conscious
of
about
active
what they're
versus
saying.
passive listening, we have a tendency to see those on some kind of dichotomy, and one's good and one's bad, but that's not
Yes.
the case.
Yeah.
Apathy,
I must have a different textbook than you.
you must. Well, I've come up with some of my own theory as
Yeah,
well
there we
in
go.
terms of what I teach.
That's
but,
not surprising.
well, passive listening comes from DeVito from the Interpersonal Communication
Okay.
book. It's
See, I've got the other one, McCormick.
Oh, well, of course you do. Why would we be in agreement on what we're teaching?
Okay, yes. So there are different authors with different, in the study of communication, there are different authors with different points of view. So DeVito is one textbook we use here, and the McCormick reflect, relate, reflect. Right, okay, good. Just clarifying
sorry,
a little
what?
bit. Okay, so
Let's talk about something interesting.
Okay, something interesting. All right.
You wanted to go back to bias, just so long as we don't talk about
Oh, that's
Lassie
right.
or Lucy.
Okay, so a few weeks ago we talked about the Otero chart.
Right.
Otero, Vanessa Otero, generated. And it had the Y and the X axes, the Y being the level of credibility and depth involved in media reporting, and then the X axis being in the middle, neutral and objective. To the right end of the X would be the right-leaning persuasion, Republican, conservative, and to the left, the liberal or Democratic point of view. And we both, I
I
think.
just realized why I interrupt you. Another reason why.
Why?
Is to speed you up.
Okay. That slows me down. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to come back to that briefly because a person could think that once they have identified the political bias in media, that they have identified media bias.
But that's the inherent problem with the tarot chart.
Yes, it's only a starting point, and it's only a specific type of media bias,
Which is
the political.
conservative or liberal.
Right.
Period. That's all
right.
it gets
And that's the only kind of bias she's looking at there. And again, there's many more media outlets that weren't even on the chart. So
Right.
it's a point. It's a good place to start the conversation. But because I was a little concerned that a person might think they have now identified media bias and they've got a handle on it, we go back to one of our favorite authors, Brooke Gladstone, in her The Influencing Machine, and she's identified 7 other very common and very powerful forms of bias in the media. So I thought we don't have to talk about all 7 like we're doing a lecture in class.
Right.
But I thought it would be interesting.
What do you think are the most prevalent there?
Well,
The most obvious ones?
She said the most powerful one is commercial bias.
Right.
Meaning
what?
Meaning what? Okay, you say.
Commercial bias?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's where a station has a tendency maybe to go through and report according to their supporters.
To make a buck.
Right.
To be profitable, to
Yeah,
stay in business.
absolutely.
It's
That's commercial bias.
it's a business concern, which actually leads me to a brief conversation we had about this newspaper in Grand Junction, Colorado, suing a state senator.
So the state senator came out and said
That the Grand Junction, I think it's the Sentinel, the Grand Junction newspaper, you could look it up
I'll look
while
it up
I'm
while you're
saying
telling
the
us the story.
that they ran a story that was fake news. And the publisher of the paper said,
The Sentinel.
hold on a minute here. That was a story based in truth because they were calling out the state senator and asking him to not squelch a bill up there in the state legislature, but to air it in his committee and let it move forward in the legislative process. The state senator took offense and accused that newspaper of writing fake news, and the publisher said, hold on a minute, we are going to sue you, state senator, for libel. Because you have now, with this comment, undermined our credibility, which is our major asset as a company. And we're going to defend ourselves like any other corporation or company would when our major assets is being
being undermined, is being lied
undermined.
about.
So their credibility is now being undermined by this statement.
I think this is an important precedent, and I hope it does go to the judiciary. Yeah, because it'll set up a precedent, I think, to fight back from it in terms of the First Amendment, of how important this credibility in the press really is. There, and I hope more get on board in terms of turning around and saying, you know what, we're doing our job, and for you to go through and libel us in that respect, you're going to have a legal consequence to that. Do you think that'll happen?
Well, he was asked by the interviewer. It was an On the Media, a short On the Media segment, 10-minute segment. He was asked by the interviewer, probably with Bob Garfield, asking him, and he said, I don't want to file a knee-jerk, knee-jerk reaction to this. So I want to make sure that I've got my arguments in place so that it has a chance of being successful, because it's tricky, very tricky. Because if the state senator couched it as an opinion that he thought they were writing fake news, as opposed to a fact that they were writing fake news, that alters the viability of this libel lawsuit, for example.
I'm looking for where he said it, and I
Okay.
can't find it at this point, but I'd like to go through and look at that, maybe follow it
Yeah.
up in 2 weeks. All he would have to say, the senator, is, in my opinion,
Exactly.
the Grand Junction Sentinel produces fake news,
Right.
and would be constitutionally protected
He would be.
within that in terms of his free
And that's how
speech.
newspapers have defended themselves in
Yes.
the past against libel
Yes.
suits, because they
Especially
are couched in terms
editorially.
of opinion.
Right.
Yes.
I
So
use
it's
that term
tricky.
in class all the time.
It's tricky, in my opinion.
So,
Yeah.
So I likewise don't get.
Yes, but so that harkens back to this one major, the most powerful bias would be commercial bias.
Okay.
A newspaper or a TV station or radio, they're a business entity. They have to pay their bills, pay their overhead, stay in business, and sometimes even make a profit. So they're going to be providing news and coverage that allows that to be successful.
However, in most news organizations, most credible news organizations, there is a wall, a divide between the sales department and editorial. Okay, in terms of news gathering, the news folks don't talk to the sales folks in terms their idea is to get the bottom line. Their idea over here in terms of the journalistic aspect of what it is they're doing is to get to the bottom line of truth in terms of the story. When those two collide, and we often see those collisions, as Brooke is pointing out, that's being one of the most overarching biases in media, they have no credibility.
Well, so how has the commercial bias been affected with the advent of internet news for free, if you will? How's that affected news reporting and news coverage for a lot of newspapers, for example, and their bottom line?
It's the whole reason why we have fake news to begin with, is that commercial bias.
Okay.
If I get enough clicks, if I get enough click-throughs on this story, I can earn so much per click-through as a result of posting this. And those who have come forward who are posting fake news have indicated the only reason why I'm doing this is to get tens of thousands of dollars a month and going through and how do I say this, perpetuating fake news, but capitalizing off of the ignorance of people who are clicking on this guy. They don't care. There's no ethic there. But that is the overarching commercial bias that's happening within that type of internet activity.
So what do we do as consumers being confronted with this powerful bias?
Well, you take a look and see who the banners are. And sometimes that becomes even tragic as well. I can't recall if we talked about the story, the Mormon handcart recreation.
You mentioned it. You mentioned it, and I'm trying to remember.
Well, we're in it now, so
yes.
Let me go through and tell the story. We don't have much time. This becomes a sad commercial bias, or could have been construed that way. A couple of years ago, it was a tragic accident. It was an LDS stake, I believe, that had their young people going through a recreation of a Mormon handcart company. It was early in the morning, and they're literally pulling their handcarts along. They're going over a ridge of a road and the sun comes up over the Wasatch Range, and it blinds a driver coming up over the road who happens to be driving a Chevrolet pickup truck.
And is not going to be expecting
a handcart company on the
pedestrians
side of the road. He can't see them, and he smashes into them.
Okay.
And it's a brutal accident. There are people who lost their lives as a result of that. So KSL ran the story, of course, but on their internet feed of the story, a banner came up over the photograph of the smashed front end of the Chevrolet pickup truck, and it was a new one. Okay, that had come into this. The banner said a certain Chevrolet proprietor in Salt Lake City was doing Pioneer Days by your pickup truck with this story running underneath it. This truck had smashed into a bunch of kids reenacting a Pioneer.
So I would want to get a picket sign, go stand in front of the establishment
Right.
and say, what is wrong with you?
Right. Okay. However, it's an arbitrary algorithm that goes through and plucks whatever banner might be pre-programmed in there. If
So
I'm an
not a
advertiser,
conscious decision
it was
on
not a
the
conscious
part of the
decision.
dealership?
No, it was not.
Okay.
No. And so here we have something that looks like it could have been commercial bias and really the wrong thing at the wrong place at the wrong time in terms of how the story was put out there. But was not in that respect. So I guess I'm talking about, I'm playing devil's advocate here with you. But I would certainly agree that when it comes to getting a story out there, I resigned my last position as a journalist over this very issue.
Because you refused to plug a advertiser
Right.
with your news story.
With the news story.
Yeah, that's right.
I was instructed to go through and make sure I get a shot of the sign in my story.
Plug the, yes.
and no.
Yes. Well, this commercial bias, so back to the question of what do we do as consumers, knowing that this is a very powerful force. And in a capitalistic economy, in the real world, businesses have to pay for themselves and turn a profit, or else they're not going to be functioning. So what do we do as consumers when we know this is there?
I think first off, you need to take a look and see what the structure is. Is there that firewall, for lack of a better term, between editorial and sales?
And how will you know
that
this?
exist? Investigate the firm, investigate the newspaper, investigate the broadcast company, and see what are their holdings.
Well, first of all, that sounds like a lot of work, but
Yes.
consider this, is that you probably rely on the same news sources day after day.
Well-
So how many news sources would you actually have to check it out? Well, just pick your ones that you rely on
Right.
and find out a little bit about those. It's like finding out about your doctor. I
It
mean, you
is.
kind of want to do, hopefully, have a little understanding of your doctor.
A couple things I want to go
Yeah.
back to here.
Okay.
You said it's a lot of work. Guess what? Being well informed is going to take a lot of work to do. That's it. It's been made so easy by having all these kinds of devices to just go through and look, and something's been push notified to you. But that's not enough. So it takes some effort, and this is one thing I'm trying to get across to our students that way, which I think they're grasping and getting into.
Well, can I just say one more thing on the, when you finish that thought?
You've interrupted
Oh,
me, and now I've
sorry.
lost the thought. I'll come back to it. Go ahead. What are you going to say?
Okay, on this commercial bias, one of the things you want to watch for is that less money may be available for the news department now because of the economic models changing. So they will be covering stories that are less expensive for them to cover
Sure.
because they don't have the funding anymore.
That's an economic bias as well as a commercial bias. that might be
Yes, and
happening.
that's what I'm putting economic bias underneath commercial.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
The reason why I listen and watch public-funded broadcasting is for that very reason. And while they have underwriters, other folks who come in and sponsor, NPR, if they're covering a story and if they have a tie, an economic tie to that story, they will go through in full disclosure, either at the beginning, at the end, or both of the story indicate that, oh, by the way, this company happens to be an underwriter of National Public Radio. Or PBS will do the same thing and say, but PBS's Frontline, for example, okay, is highly subsidized by the federal government. And there's a lot of people who don't like that at all. And yet, Frontline's reporting comes out and holds the federal government's feet to the fire. I mean, talk about biting the hand that feeds you. They rip it off at the shoulder, okay, in terms of being completely transparent and showing what's really going on with the checks and balances of
Thank
the government.
heavens.
Right.
Thank heavens.
I guess that's the reason why I stay there, why I don't branch out to go through and see what else is going on, other than maybe some of the old mainstays.
Well, you only have so many hours in the day, right? So what you're saying is you're consuming what you think is the highest quality news media, as opposed to spending your time grazing elsewhere.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'm fascinated by, though, where was I? I was up in Salt Lake, and I was watching the news for the weather, for what was going on. And I was going between KSL, KUTV, and KTVX. And I do that.
Are
It
those
drives
the-
everybody crazy who's in the same
Are
room
those
with
the
me.
main
Those
broadcasts?
are the three, that's
Okay.
the Salt Lake market, okay,
Okay.
in terms of what's going on. And so I'm going to look at their three weather broadcasts. But as I was doing so, no, you know what, I have to change the story. Because it wasn't a local news, it was a national news that I was watching to get to the, anyway, long story. I'm sorry, I'm wasting all this time here as we go along. I counted in a half-hour show, and I'm not sure how many breaks there were, but I counted 11 different pharmaceutical ads happening. About 83% of the advertising that's happening within primetime national, non-affiliate, I'm talking about the main networks, okay? About 83% of their advertising is pharmaceutical.
Oh boy.
What's the commercial bias there then in terms of actually accurately reporting on something as critical as the Affordable Care Act and the restructuring of what's happening with that?
Interesting that you mentioned them as the biggest sponsors of mainstream media, because they are so. Them, the pharmaceutical industry, healthcare industry, and the financial industry are the two biggest campaign contributors to our elected officials. So maybe there's just too high a profit margin in those industries. Seriously, if they have all that money to spend on advertising
Well,
and campaign support, maybe their profit margins are out of whack.
maybe if people weren't buying new iPhones, they could afford their own health care.
Oh no, I'm totally lost on that one.
No, that's a jab to Jason Chaffetz, who came out and said those
Oh.
very words yesterday in defense of the new Republican plan. That came out.
Oh, okay.
I just threw up a little bit in the
All
back
right.
of my. There we go. Okay, I feel better now.
All right. So we have like 30 seconds. What do you want to say
Go
at the
ahead.
end here?
Happy Women's Day. I hope you get a chance
you.
to go through an International Women's Day as things roll. I don't. Do you have anything else?
Let's see.
I don't want to take up all this
In
time.
the last 30 seconds?
20 seconds.
Oh, I lost my
15.
notes.
We're
Right.
down to
It's
15
the end of
seconds.
that.
So no
Okay.
show next week.
Yes.
Okay, because we're at spring break. We'll be back in 2
We're
weeks.
going to be
though.
springing around.
We will be springing around. We hope
Oh.
you have a good spring
Yes,
break.
we will come back to media bias again and again because it's
Okay.
so important to recognize.
Thanks for joining us today on Talking Point Live. We'll see you a little later on. Watch us on Facebook.